Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to another episode of the Identity Christ Is podcast, where we address common misconceptions with Christianity. I am your co-host, Dylan Schweitzer.
I am Jaylen Thompson.
And we're very excited to be talking about a very seemingly controversial topic in the Bible. So, the thing we're going to be talking about today was Abraham sacrificing Isaac immoral?
Dum, dum, dum.
And so I think the first thing we need to do when we're approaching anything in the Bible is we need some biblical literacy tips. So I got 5 or 6 things I think we need to keep in the forefront of our mind before we approach this text, or really any text in general. So the first thing I like to consider is I like to recognize my own stupidity.
Right.
The Bible is a very, very complicated set of texts. It has varying different genres of literature, large overarching themes, and several minor stories weaving together to make one large meta story. If you don't understand something, that is because you are stupid. And I'm saying this as if I'm talking to a mirror, because a lot of times I'll read something in the Bible, I have no idea what's going on.
Oh, for sure.
It's not the Bible's fault. It is your fault.
Right.
And I mean stupid in a technical sense. I mean, you are lacking understanding. You are ignorant on what's going on, and you need to dig into it. And so that's the first tip, is just to kind of bring a little bit of humility, recognize your stupidity a little bit. Some of the other tips I like to think about is the historical and the cultural context of the text. You know, if I bring my 21st century modern view to a text that, you know, some of the things in the Bible are over 3,000 years old, or at least have roots in a culture that's 3,000 years old. And if I bring my modern lens to the text, my cultural lens to the text, it's going to cause a lot of problems.
A lot of misunderstanding, a lot of misinterpreting. You're just going to have a lot of problems. You're going to walk away with a totally different understanding of the text than perhaps the writer intended.
Absolutely. Another great tip for biblical literacy is genre awareness. I need to understand what kind of genre am I even reading before I begin. Is it a narrative? Is it poetry? Is it prophecy? These things are super important. For example, there's a really interesting thing in the Psalms where I think it says something about like the trees clapping in the praise of God and everything. And if I thought that was a historical statement, I would think this book is ridiculous.
Right.
But it's the Psalms, and that is poetry. So it's saying that nature is, like, in a poetic sense, singing the glory and praise of God. In a symbolic sense.
That God's creation worships him.
Right. Exactly. The last couple of things, real briefly, is contextual analysis. Place the passage within the broader context of its book, in what passage of the Bible, or section of the Bible, I should say, and then within the overarching narrative. Oftentimes you'll say, well, look what this Bible verse says, and then compare it to something on the other side of the Bible and say, see, look, there's a contradiction, as if there's not thousands of years of history in between them.
Right.
We want to look at the text, the surrounding texts around it, the chapter, the chapters surrounding it, the book itself, and then where that book is placed within the overarching narrative.
Yeah, I mean, what major events are going on, if a major event is going on, what's going on with the people at the time, the social, political, economic climate of the time. I mean, there's so many things to consider contextually whenever you're looking at the Bible and reading the Bible.
Absolutely.
And another one is textual analysis. Did we go over that one? I don't think we did.
The contextual?
No, textual.
Okay.
Just examining like the language and like the word choices of the writers within the Bible, and the grammatical structure even within the passage, especially when you're talking about Aramaic and Greek writings. And then if it's possible, I strongly consider, actually there's an app called the Bible Hub that allows you to do this, but diving into the original languages of the text for like the original nuanced meanings that they may have at the time, because words can carry several different meanings. And so you want to make sure that you're applying the right meaning to the text in the way the writer intended for you to understand it.
Absolutely. And last little tip is just to consult commentaries. So bridging off of that, so not only can you use Bible Hub to access that, but you could see what other scholars who have really studied this text in depth can talk about the text. And oftentimes they're going to bring their own scholarly perspective to it too. So if you have several commentaries, you can kind of juxtapose to one another and bounce it back off the Bible or the passage that you're reading in the Bible. You'll gain a lot more insight that you wouldn't have already guessed.
You know, a bonus one I would even add to this is like trying to research and understand early church history and interpretation of text.
Absolutely.
That'll be a really huge one as well, because they're far closer to these events than we are. And so I think it would help to better understand the text if you understand historically how the church has always viewed certain things, or early church fathers viewed certain texts in light of their their closeness to the events themselves.
Right. Culturally and just from a chronological standpoint.
Right. So. Exactly.
Anyways, those are our general biblical literacy tips just to kind of keep in the back of your mind when you're approaching any passage, but especially the one we're going to look at today. So the passage that we're going to look at is Genesis 22, 1 through 19. Jaylen, would you like to read it, or I can?
Sure. I will read it. So starting at verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over and worship and come to you again. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father, Abraham, my father. And he said, Here I am, my son. He said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order to bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for I now know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and you have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba.
Wonderful. All right, so let's kind of dive into this somewhat lengthy passage of scripture here.
Yep.
I think on the surface, it's a very strange story. Let me make that very clear.
For sure.
I think a lot of people in Christendom, what other faith tradition you're coming from, unfortunately don't give enough time and energy really understanding this passage. I've actually known people who were very discouraged about Christianity. And part of it was because when they were growing up, they learned about the story, but no one really paid attention to it much. They kind of looked at it as, well, you know, we should be like Isaac, obedient no matter what. And that sounds insane.
And theologically, it was very much glossed over, or not even acknowledged theologically. It was more so kind of just told as a, here's what happened.
Yeah, almost like this is a news report, and I'm just trying to keep you up to date.
Yeah, but none of the theological or Christological significance of it was brought up. It was kind of just, Abraham was going to kill his son.
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
And then God told him not to.
Good thing we have the New Testament now, right?
Right. Yeah, that's kind of how it was brought up.
Yeah,
I agree with that.
The Old Testament, especially these, we could say more archaic stories, are just kind of swept under the rug.
Right.
Like, oh, it was the Old Testament, so we don't care as much because we're in the New Testament, as if that's a good answer, as if that doesn't change the morality of the situation.
And boy, is that a mistake. What a mistake that is.
Yeah, and I think it's atrocious because there's a lot you can gather out of here, but it's, like I said, just swept under the rug. So, couple of primary things to kind of think about in this first section we're going to discuss is in the context of Genesis overall, because obviously we're not going to read all of Genesis. That would take like a whole podcast to read all 50 chapters. But if you kind of zoom out a little bit outside of these 19 verses, Abraham has been tested many times in his life. He's been tested to offer up things to God, whether it's his own life in a symbolic sense, in a circumcision sense. And so some of the tests he passed, some of them he failed. Some of them were from courage, some of them from an offering of some sense. This account specifically is obviously going to be the greatest test of trusting God or having faith in God. One of the first things I think is really interesting is these primary allusions of a symbolic representation of God the Father and God the Son as being symbolized, or as a kind of typological representation of Abraham and Isaac. And if you're unfamiliar with the word typology, it's kind of like showing a type that is a representative. So it's kind of saying, look at this figure from the past. They're kind of a foreshadowing representation of a character in the future. So God the Father and God the Son are kind of represented with Abraham and Isaac, and vast similarities between that story and God offering Christ as a sacrifice on Calvary.
Which, geographically speaking, wasn't very far from where Abraham was to offer Isaac.
Yeah, Moriah and Calvary were pretty close from a geographical sense.
Actually, Calvary was just ahead of Moriah, which is kind of chronologically significant from a foreshadowing standpoint, because, you know, it's ahead of where we are. Like, we have to keep going forward to get there. And, you know, so just an observation. But go ahead.
Yeah, so kind of looking at the theological things before we get into the morality of the situation. There's like actually 30 typological similarities between the representations we just talked about. I'm just going to bring up 9 that I think were the most important or noteworthy. The first one being, both are the one and only begotten Son of the Father.
That is Isaac and Jesus.
Isaac and Jesus. Yeah. 2 servants whom Abraham ordered to stay with the donkey represented the Jewish people who would not ascend or reach the place of sacrifice because they would not believe in Christ. So this is representation of the Jewish people staying behind as the ones making the sacrifice are going and ascending up the mountain. The sacrifices take place in the same mountain like we just talked about, or a similar geographical location. The son carried the wood or the cross to the place of sacrifice in both accounts. The son was submissive to the will of the father. As you can see, Isaac willingly carried all these things up the mountain and willingly obeyed his father, just like how Christ did this in the accounts we see in the gospel. You know, we think of him before he goes up to Calvary, say, "Not my will be done, but yours be done."
In the Garden of Gethsemane.
Exactly. The sixth one would be the son was bound or lain to the wood or the cross, just like in both stories. The Lord himself provided the sacrifice at the end. So in the context of Isaac, it was a ram in the thicket. In the context of the Passion story, it was Christ himself who presented and provided the sacrifice. The last couple of here is the ram was caught up in the thorns, and Jesus also had a crown of thorns on his head. And so what's really interesting is when Isaac is about to be sacrificed, they notice the ram in the thickets. But the weird thing is what's promised is a lamb in the account. And so it's kind of showing that there is this sacrifice that's provided, but it's hinting towards like this isn't the sacrifice that's going to be provided in this context. It's kind of pointing towards something further down the road right away. And as John the Baptist sees Christ at the beginning of his ministry, he says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." And then the last one is they are both resurrected, or in Isaac's sense, symbolically, resurrected on the 3rd day. Because as you remember, Isaac and Abraham, it was a 3-day trip up the mountain.
Right.
So Those are some of the cool typological similarities that we can kind of think about here. I think another thing we need to consider before we get into the morality of the situation is understanding what a covenant is.
Right.
And so a covenant is kind of like a giant promise or contract that is representative to adopting people into the family. So, for example, if I make a contract with Jaylen here, maybe over property or an exchange of goods or something like that.
Better read the fine print.
Right. You can, I can violate that contract and he could just say, we're done here. But in covenantal bonds and things like that, how it was understood in the ancient world, it was accepting people into your own family. It wasn't a simple thing that you could just break and get out of.
Yes.
And so by God promises to bless all the families of the world through Abraham is one of the first covenants we see. And he's trying to see if Abraham can be trusted by going through this process of these different trials and tribulations to see if he can continue giving a fuller and greater covenant in general.
Yeah, which is interesting to consider when you consider that God asked him to sacrifice his own son, because there's almost like it's a two-way street in relates to trust, right? Like it's like, Abraham, I'm getting ready to ask you to do something and I need you to trust me, right? And Abraham needs to trust God with what he's being asked to do, to trust that whatever God is asking him to do, like he has the best intention for whatever result that he's trying to see.
Right.
So it's almost like it's a two-way street there. You know what I mean? It's not only, can God trust Abraham, but God is also working, hey, Abraham, I can be trusted also.
Right.
Just speaks to the relationship that God is looking to develop with Abraham at this point in time, and with people, his descendants later on.
Absolutely. So that's a lot of the theological things that we can kind of grasp from the story at all. But that could be all fine and dandy, but you could still look at this and be like, but really, like, God asks him to sacrifice his son. This seems kind of strange. This seems immoral to some sense too. Like, why is this a good thing? Why is this something we're reading and thinking, yeah, I'm glad this happened even? And so kind of analyzing the morality of the situation, I think, is really important. One thing to consider is the ancient Hebrew storytelling techniques required readers to see seemingly separate stories and as extremely related. So before the story begins, Genesis 22 starts with "after all these things." So they're trying to draw a parallel with the previous account in Genesis, with the one right before it, with Ishmael. And in Genesis 21, God promises to make Ishmael a great nation, as he is a descendant of Abraham, implying that the nation that God promised Abraham would not be fulfilled through Ishmael, since they were sent away and conceived immorally against God. So we have good reason to believe that Abraham... Oh, sorry. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself there. So we could see that Ishmael was conceived by an immoral means. And so the problem is God's blessing is not going to go through that way, because he kind of bypassed God in some way by trying to bring about the covenant.
Yeah, he used ungodly methods to try and achieve a godly result.
Right. And so he promised him before all this that Isaac is how I'm going to bring about the nations. And then right after that, he says, okay, and now what I need you to do is I need you to sacrifice him to me. And at first you're like, what?
Yeah, it's almost like, okay, I gave him to you, now give him back.
Yeah, like how is your will going to be get done? Like, you made me a promise, like, that doesn't make any sense, right? And so I think that's extremely important to consider before we analyze anything further, is like, there's this context of like, you just promised me that I'm going to have a giant family through this child, and now I have to sacrifice him to you? That makes no sense.
And the child that I did have before him is been sent off into the wilderness.
And you just told me that's not the blessing you said you're going to give me.
Yeah, and I have no idea where he is.
Yeah, right. He's gone.
Yeah.
And so I think that's extremely important to consider, because if I was in Abraham's shoes, I would have a lot of questions.
Oh, for sure.
I'd have a lot of things. So I'm like, hey, God, this makes no dang sense to me.
Right.
And so if I've been in communion or a covenantal relationship with God, I've been communicating with him, however way you want to look at that, I've learned things about God's character. And I've learned that he has blessed me in other ways already. And I think after a while, you could start to deduce what Abraham is thinking through on what God can and can't do, will and won't do. And I think we have good reason to believe that Abraham didn't think that this event would actually end in this the actual destruction of Isaac. I think that's the big thing here, because I think you have to really understand the subtext, the things in between the lines. Because I mean, these stories are also hyper condensed, former oral traditions. You know what I mean? I'm not going to say, oh, there's a hidden passage somewhere that we don't know. I'm just saying, when you really think about the situation, it's not as if he's just kind of like, oh, okay, whatever. I think if you were asked to sacrifice your own son, I think you'd have a lot to think about.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
So I think we have good reason to believe Abraham didn't think this event would end in the destruction of Isaac. It also says in Genesis 22:5, we will both come again to you.
Yeah, that's Abraham talking to two young men.
No, he's saying that to the Jews that they left behind at the bottom of the mountain.
Right.
He's saying we're both going to come back to you.
Oh, got it.
And so, I mean, we have evidence before we even get to the top of the mountain, we're both coming back.
Right.
And so he seems pretty convinced in his mind that whatever is going to happen, we're both coming back.
Yeah.
I think that's the key thing here. So it implies that Abraham knew that his son would have reasoned that God could even raise Isaac from the dead. And we also know this from Hebrews 11, 17, and 19, explicitly laying that concept out, that Abraham reasoned that he would raise Isaac from the dead.
Right.
And I think the other aspect is, I don't think Isaac is a victim either. I think Isaac willingly became the sacrifice on the altar. And there's a couple things we can kind of think about here. So Abraham was old as crap.
Yes.
He was in like his 90s.
That's when Isaac was born. He was old as crap. So by the time Isaac is strong enough to carry wood up a mountain, yeah, Abraham's pretty old.
Yeah, and Abraham couldn't carry the wood up the mountain. That's part of the reason why Isaac did it.
Right.
And this wasn't like a quick 5-minute trip. It was a couple days.
And that's an interesting concept to consider, that Abraham couldn't carry the wood up the mountain. Like, it's interesting to consider that, like, even with us, right? Like, part of the reason why we need Christ is because we can't carry our own wood up the mountain. Right.
Interesting.
It's like we need somebody else to do it for us.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, that's just something to consider. When you said it, it kind of like stuck with me. Like, yeah, like he couldn't do it himself, so he had someone more capable than himself,
right,
do it. And that's kind of like what we need.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, if you take that concept of a man, a young boy in his youth, I don't know his explicit age, but he's obviously old enough to reason and to carry, large pieces of wood up a mountain, everything. We could say anywhere from like 14 to 18, even. Yeah,
this is a strong kid. Whatever.
He's hit a little bit of puberty at least.
For sure. He got some testosterone at this point.
And so, anyways, it's very clear that if Isaac wanted to overpower his father, he easily could have.
Or at least took off running.
Could have ran away.
Yeah, it's not like Abraham's going to catch him.
Yeah, so maybe Isaac didn't know the plan at the bottom of the mountain, but at the bottom of the mountain, Abraham knew that they were both coming back. Or at least he believed very strongly that they were both coming back. And we could see contextually from the text that Isaac was strong enough to either overpower, run away, or it just evade the concept overall. And he's likely old enough to deduce whether or not he wants to do it with all that in context. So,
and it shows with Abraham too that though he didn't necessarily understand what God was asking for at that particular moment, at that particular time, he had enough trust in the character of God that had been revealed to him through past experiences to know that I don't necessarily know what's going to happen up on this mountain, but he's revealed enough of his character to me to where I know that everything's going to be okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So I don't think he knows exactly how it's going to work. He, even from the context, you just promised me to bless the nations through the son, and now you're telling me that I have to sacrifice the son to you. I think he's reasoned that I don't know what's going to happen, but everything's going to kind of work out, and I'm just going to kind of follow you even when it doesn't make sense.
Right.
So if we think about all of that in context, we can also see there's no indication from the text that Isaac was unwilling to go on the altar. He's a little confused at first when you first get there. Like, yo, man, where's the lamb? But he willingly lays on the wood, or has the wood laid on him, I should say, and is open to make this sacrifice for the will of the Father. And I think that's the big takeaway. He's not a victim. He's a voluntary sacrifice, and kind of bringing it back to the beginning of the episode, it's a typological reference to how Christ willingly sacrificed himself for his people. And so I think that is the big thing we have to consider, is that Abraham at least believed very strong that they were both coming back, and that Isaac was definitely not a victim.
Right.
So
absolutely. So what about like other interpretations?
Yeah, so I really wanted to talk about like the tradition of the rabbinic interpretation and early church fathers talking about this sort of stuff. Yeah. But when I started digging it up, it seemed like it was going to be a whole other podcast episode.
Yeah, let's not do that.
So if you guys really want to talk about ancient Talmudic and Midrash and some ancient church father sermons and homilies, talk about this stuff.
Talk about the Akedah.
Oh, yeah, man.
The binding of Isaac.
If you want to talk about the interpretive tradition around this text, let us know in the comments. We could do a follow-up where we just talk about the historical tradition surrounding this text.
Yeah.
But just to give you a couple things to consider, I mean, this text is discussed and talked about in Midrash Rabbah, in the Talmudic discussions, in Akadia. Oh, man, I'm going to butcher all of these. In the Babylonian Talmud, in Sanhedrin 89b. The Rashi commentary in Genesis 21 is a comprehensive commentary on the entire Tanakh. And then also some early church fathers to discuss this, like St. Augustine, St. John of Christendom, and St. Ambrose, all kind of talked about this in their homilies. And they all seem to support the view that Isaac was not a victim, and that he was a willing participant, and that that Abraham reasoned that God could raise Isaac from the dead, or at least believed very strongly that whatever's going to work out, they're both going to come back. So if you want to see us talk about that, let us know in the comments, or you can even message us directly if you're feeling a little adventurous and frisky. But
well, speaking of adventurous, so what can we learn from this story, right? Ultimately, what can we glean from this story, this seemingly cruel, wicked, sick joke? right that it can be looked at that way, you know, upon a surface level glance. But I think if you look at it that way from a surface level glance, that you're gonna actually end up missing the forest for the trees. Right. What ultimately gets seen here by us having a God's eye view of the text, that Abraham and Isaac themselves didn't necessarily have in the story, is we get to see the culmination of the gospel. And the way that we get to see that is, I forgot how long of a time frame there is between Abraham and Jesus.
Good amount of time.
Yeah, but it's a couple thousand years, I believe. Something along those lines. And so Abraham wasn't going to see the fulfillment of God's promise to redeem his people. So Abraham even got to see the fulfillment of prophecy, or not got to see the fulfillment, but see the foreshadowing of the fulfillment of prophecies even before his time.
Yeah.
Because also what took place on Mount Calvary with Jesus was the fulfillment of Genesis chapter 3 verse 15, I believe, is where it talks about the seed of the woman crushing the head of the serpent. And when Abraham was on Mount Moriah with Isaac, he also got to get a foreshadowing of that fulfillment, because remember, Mount Calvary was just ahead, and Abraham got a sneak peek into the kind of the entire reason and fulfillment of why God called him to the adventure of his life in the first place. It was to initiate through him the entrance of the Savior into the world, who would save the entire world and offer us a gift of salvation through the work, life, death, and ministry of Jesus Christ.
Well said.
And that pretty much ties up the what I think can be gleaned from the story. I think what can be gleaned from the story here is that God asking Abraham to trust him one more time, and then in Abraham getting witness to, and Abraham getting to hear the gospel before it was even presented. That ultimately God was going to provide the sacrifice necessary to satisfy his own wrath and alleviate us from having to suffer the consequences of our own choices to rebel against him, but that God was going to satisfy his own wrath through the life, death, and ministry of Jesus Christ, and we would get the opportunity to bask in the grace as opposed to the wrath, if you so choose to.
Well said. So what do you think? Is God still an immoral, capricious, evil monster? Or did we convince you to maybe consider a different position? Let us know in the comments what you thought, how we kind of dove into this passage in general. Like I said, if you want us to do more on this topic in general, let us know. Or if there's other seemingly challenging things in the Bible that you would love us to discuss, let us know. Again, I am your co-host, Dylan Schweitzer.
I am Jaylen Thompson.
And this has been For the Kingdom.
As always, for the kingdom. We out.